Somewhere in a temperature-controlled vault at Yale University, there is a book that has been sitting quietly for over 600 years, and in all that time, not a single person on Earth has been able to read it. Not medieval scholars, not Renaissance cryptographers, not the codebreakers who cracked Nazi Enigma transmissions during the Second World War, not modern linguists armed with computational tools that can analyze millions of patterns in seconds. The book just sits there holding whatever it holds, refusing to give it up. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual situation we're in with the Voynich Manuscript. And the reason it keeps drawing researchers back, the reason it still generates serious academic papers and not just YouTube rabbit holes, is that it doesn't behave the way a fake should behave. It doesn't behave the way a simple cipher should behave either. It behaves like something we don't have a category for yet. And that is a genuinely strange place for a physical object to put us. Before we go anywhere, I want to be honest with you about something. This is not a video where everything gets explained by the end. If you're looking for the reveal, the cracked code, the triumphant moment where the mystery dissolves, this isn't that. Because that moment hasn't happened. What we can do is look carefully at what is actually known, what the physical evidence tells us, what 6 centuries of intelligent people have tried and failed to do, and why this particular mystery keeps resisting everyone who approaches it. That's a different kind of satisfying, but it's real. Here's the core problem that makes the Voynich Manuscript so difficult to walk away from. The text inside it is consistent, it has structure, it has patterns that look like grammar. Certain symbols appear frequently, others rarely in distributions that match how natural languages behave. There are what appear to be word boundaries. There are repeating sequences that look like they could be verb conjugations or noun endings. Statistical analysis of the text produces results that, on paper, look like a real language being used by someone who knew what they were doing. And yet, after every serious attempt to extract meaning from it, the content remains completely opaque. That combination, consistent structure with zero confirmed translation, is what makes this a genuine scholarly mystery rather than just an unsolved puzzle. It's not that we haven't tried hard enough, it's that the harder people try, the stranger the results get. So what we're going to do together is slow down and actually look at this thing. Not jump straight to theories, not race toward conclusions, but start with what we can physically verify and work outward from there. The manuscript has been radiocarbon dated. That places the vellum it's written on in the early 15th century, most likely somewhere between 1404 and 1438. The ink, the quire structure, the binding, the pigments used in the illustrations, all of that has been examined by conservators and historians. There are things we know, there are things we can reasonably infer. And then there is everything else, which is where the theories live, some of them fascinating, some of them almost certainly wrong, and a few that remain genuinely plausible even now. The manuscript is divided into sections, plants that don't match any known species, astronomical diagrams that don't quite line up with any known system, pages filled with small human figures bathing in interconnected pools and channels, lists that might be recipes or labels or something else entirely. Each section will tell us something different, and each section will also leave us with new questions. That's the rhythm of this investigation. Every answer opens into a longer corridor. If you're listening to this at 2 in the morning with your eyes half closed, that's genuinely fine. That's actually kind of the right way to approach a mystery this old and this patient. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Seriously, I read those. There's something about knowing that someone in Stockholm is hearing this at 3 a.m. while someone in Melbourne is on their lunch break that makes the whole thing feel appropriately strange, which matches the subject matter perfectly. And if you prefer your listening completely free of interruption, no ads, no background music, just the voice and the material, you can follow along on Spotify. The link is in the description. That's where this sounds the way it was meant to. Now back to the book. What we're really asking, underneath all the specific questions about plants and stars and ciphers, is this: what kind of text produces consistent, structured, statistically plausible writing across hundreds of pages without any of it ever yielding to translation? The possibilities are narrow, and each one is unsettling in its own way. It could be a constructed language that no one ever learned to speak outside of one very secretive place. It could be an elaborate encryption of a real language, layered in ways that defeat even modern cryptanalysis. It could be a sophisticated hoax, built by someone who understood enough about how language looks to fake the appearance of meaning without ever including any. Or it could be something else, a category we haven't fully imagined yet, which is the kind of sentence that usually sounds like an excuse, but in this case is actually a live possibility. 600 years of silence from a book is remarkable. The fact that the silence has held through the age of computing, through the development of statistical linguistics, through every tool we've built for cracking codes and pattern-matching text, makes it something more than remarkable. It makes it genuinely worth sitting with, so that's what we're going to do. Take it section by section, layer by layer, with the patience the thing seems to demand. Let's start with what it actually is. The manuscript is held at the Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, which is worth pausing on for a moment. The Voynich is not a general archive. It's a specialized facility designed specifically for rare and fragile materials, with climate control, restricted handling protocols, and the kind of institutional oversight that tends to surround objects of significant historical or cultural weight. The fact that the Voynich Manuscript lives there tells you something before you've looked at a single page. It tells you that the people who study these things for a living consider it worth protecting at that level. You can view high-resolution scans of the entire manuscript online for free, which Yale has made available through their digital collections. But the physical object itself is not something most people will ever handle, and that distinction matters when we start talking about what the material tests can and can't tell us. So, what is it, physically? It's a book made of vellum, which is prepared animal skin, most likely calf. Not paper. Vellum was the standard writing material for serious documents in medieval Europe, and it's also why the manuscript survived in the condition it has. Vellum is durable in ways that paper simply isn't. Pages are organized into gatherings called quires, which are the folded bundles of leaves that get sewn together to form a book. Some quires appear to be missing. The current page count runs to around 240 pages, but the numbering suggests there were once more, and wherever those pages went, they took whatever was on them with them. The binding is not original. What the manuscript was bound in during its earliest life, and how many times it has been rebound since, is not fully established. The current binding is later, which means the quire structure and the physical sequencing of the pages are things scholars have had to reason about partly through content, rather than being able to rely on a binding that was there from the beginning. That's a constraint worth keeping in mind. Radiocarbon dating was carried out in 2009 by the University of Arizona, and those results are the closest thing we have to a firm anchor in time. The vellum itself dated to a range of roughly 1404 to 1438, with the highest probability cluster pointing toward the early decades of the 15th century. This is important, and also limited in specific ways. What was dated was the vellum, the animal skin, not the ink on top of it. It's theoretically possible to write on old vellum, though doing so convincingly across 240 pages of highly consistent text would be an extraordinary effort, and most researchers treat the dating as a reliable indicator of when the manuscript was actually created. But it's worth being precise about what the test measured, because that precision is part of how we avoid overclaiming. The vellum is early 1400s. The writing on it is very probably from around the same period. Those are slightly different statements, and the difference matters when someone asks how confident we are. The ink has been analysed as well. X-ray fluorescence studies found it consistent with iron gall ink, which was the standard ink of medieval European scribes. The pigments used in the illustrations have also been examined, and they are consistent with materials available in 15th century Europe. None of the material tests have produced results that contradict the radiocarbon dating, and none have uncovered anything that would be anomalous for a genuine medieval manuscript. What the tests have not done is tell us who made it, where exactly in Europe it was made, or in what language. The materials are authentic to a time and a broad region. They don't narrow it further than that. When you look at the pages themselves, one of the things that strikes researchers immediately is the consistency of the scribal hand. The text runs in lines with fairly regular spacing. The baseline is steady. The symbol forms are executed with what looks like practiced fluency, not the hesitation you'd expect from someone laboriously copying an invented system one character at a time. Some researchers believe they can identify more than one hand in the manuscript, suggesting multiple scribes, but even if that's true, the overall visual coherence of the text is striking. It doesn't look like someone was making it up as they went. It looks like someone who knew what they were writing. The illustrations complicate and enrich this picture considerably. Large sections of the manuscript contain full-page or multi-page fold-out images. There are fold-out astronomical diagrams. There are botanical illustrations, one plant per page in most cases, drawn with what looks like genuine observational intent, even though the plants themselves don't cleanly match any known species. There are pages showing small human figures in pools and channels, connected by what might be plumbing or might be something more symbolic. These images constrain interpretation in both directions. They suggest the manuscript is organized thematically, that whoever made it had something specific in mind for each section. But they also resist easy categorization because the plants aren't identifiable. The astronomical diagrams don't align neatly with known medieval systems, and the bathing figures don't match any single tradition scholars have been able to pin down. What we can take from all of this without overreaching is that the Voynich Manuscript is a genuine medieval artifact, produced on authentic materials from the early 15th century, written in a consistent and apparently practiced script organized into thematic sections with illustrations that show real effort and intention, and produced by someone or a small group of someones who clearly knew what they were doing, even if we have no idea what they were actually doing. That's the honest summary of what the physical evidence gives us. It rules out some things. It doesn't solve anything. It puts us in the early 1400s, somewhere in Europe, holding a book that was made on purpose, for a purpose we still can't determine. And that's where the real questions begin. When you first look at the text, before you know any of the history, it doesn't feel like random scribbling. Your eye starts to pick out recurring shapes. There are tall, looped characters, squat ones that hug the line, glyphs that look a bit like numbers, others that resemble fragments of Latin cursive. Certain clusters keep coming back again and again, in different places, on different pages, in different sections. Your brain, which is extremely good at pattern detection whether you want it to be or not, starts whispering, "This is writing." And in some important ways it behaves like writing. The symbols that researchers call glyphs are not just scattered arbitrarily. They appear in sequences that have clear internal structure. Some glyphs mostly show up at the beginnings of these sequences, some in the middle, some overwhelmingly at the end. If you think of the sequences as words, then certain glyphs seem to play the role of common prefixes or suffixes. There are also glyphs that almost never stand alone, but instead occur only as part of larger clusters. That's exactly the kind of positional behavior you see in real scripts that encode language. When you count things, the picture gets even stranger and more convincing. Across the manuscript, some glyphs are very frequent, some are rare. The distribution is skewed in a way that looks a lot like what linguists see in genuine texts. Word-like units follow a pattern reminiscent of Zipf's law. A small number of words occur very often. A larger number occur occasionally, and a long tail appear only once or twice. That's what you'd expect from meaningful text, not from someone just doodling shapes or copying random ink blots. The words also cluster by context. The botanical pages have certain favourites. The bathing pages have others. The astronomical diagrams show yet another dominant vocabulary. There's overlap, but also clear section-specific tendencies, the same way a medical textbook will contain more instances of artery and lesion than a book of poetry. That doesn't tell us what any of the words mean. It does tell us the system is not behaving like noise. It's not just frequencies. There are constraints. Some letters hardly ever follow others. Certain combinations that would be easy to write, mechanically, simply don't occur. That kind of pattern, where the script seems to have hidden grammatical rules about what can go where, is one of the reasons so many cryptographers, linguists and statisticians are reluctant to dismiss the whole thing as a hoax. If this is nonsense, it is exquisitely structured nonsense. At the same time, the manuscript doesn't present as a single, perfectly uniform hand from beginning to end. Scholars who've spent years staring at the pages have proposed that there are at least two major scribal hands in the text, sometimes labelled Scribe 1 and Scribe 2, with a few suggesting even more fine-grained distinctions. These hands differ in subtle but consistent ways: the angle of certain strokes, the way particular glyphs are formed, the tightness of the line spacing, even the relative thickness of curves versus straight segments. One scribe tends to write slightly more compactly, another leaves more vertical breathing room. These aren't the wild differences you'd expect between unrelated people learning an invented code from scratch. They look more like the variations you see between scribes trained in the same script, or the same person writing under different conditions over time. What that implies is important. Multiple trained hands suggest that whatever this system is, it could be something more than a private idiosyncrasy. It might have been taught, at least within a small circle. It might have had a life outside this single book, in other documents that haven't survived or simply haven't been recognized. This is speculation, but it flows from a basic observation. The script is stable enough that more than one person can use it consistently. For all that apparent regularity, there are basic things we don't know with full confidence. The text appears to run left to right, with lines progressing from top to bottom in a way that resembles Latin manuscripts of the same era. The glyphs lean and connect in ways that make that reading direction seem overwhelmingly likely. But in the absence of a bilingual inscription or clear punctuation marks, even direction is, strictly speaking, an inference. We also don't know whether the spaces are real. The text is segmented into units that look exactly like words separated by spaces. But in a cipher, those spaces can be misleading. They might conceal the boundaries of an underlying plaintext, or they could be inserted at regular intervals just to mimic natural language. In an unknown natural script, they might represent syllables, morphemes, or something else entirely. There's no way so far to prove that the visible word breaks match the way the underlying information, if any, is chunked. Most fundamentally, we have no direct handle on phonetic value. In a normal script, you can say, this symbol stands for this sound, or for this consonant with a built-in vowel, or for this syllable. Here, we can't tie any glyph to a sound in any known language. Without that anchor, we can't look for cognates, can't test straightforward substitution ciphers, can't align the text with parallel versions in other tongues. All the familiar tricks you'd use when approaching an undeciphered but suspected language, like Linear B or Egyptian before the Rosetta Stone, are much harder to apply. That ambiguity cuts both ways. Not being able to read the text does not mean it's meaningless. It might encode a natural language in an unfamiliar script. It might be a cipher, where the apparent alphabet is disguising another one underneath. It might be something more exotic, a constructed language or a shorthand or a hybrid system that mixes code and plain text. At the same time, the fact that it looks language-like does not guarantee that it genuinely carries linguistic content. A sufficiently careful forger, or someone with a taste for artificial scripts, could, in principle, have engineered glyph distributions and word patterns that deceive our pattern-hungry brains. This is where a particular danger creeps in. If you assume from the start that the manuscript is meaningless, you will inevitably interpret every regularity as an artifact of your own method or as proof of self-delusion in others. If you assume from the start that it must be meaningful, you will be tempted to see significance in every fluctuation and to declare decipherments on the flimsiest of correspondences. Both assumptions harden into dogma very quickly, and once they do, the manuscript stops being a puzzle and becomes a mirror. To try to keep the discussion on firmer ground, researchers have done something very simple and very powerful. They've agreed, more or less, on a way to type the unreadable text. One of the most widely used tools is called EVA, the extended Voynich alphabet. It's not a claim about what the glyphs really are. It's a convention. For each distinct symbol shape in the manuscript, EVA assigns a Latin letter or letter combination. The strange 4-like glyph becomes one EVA symbol, the tall P like one another, and so on. The goal is not to say this stands for the sound K or this means water. The goal is just to have a consistent way to represent the script in ordinary text files. Once you have that, you can count things. You can run frequency analyses, search for recurring sequences, compare the vocabulary of one section to another, and share your results with other researchers who will be looking at exactly the same underlying strings. EVA and similar transcription systems turn the opaque handwritten script into machine-readable data, without smuggling in assumptions about language or meaning. They let cryptographers test cipher hypotheses, let linguists probe for statistical signatures of natural language, and let skeptics check whether an apparent pattern is robust or just an illusion. In other words, even without knowing what any of it says, or if it says anything at all, we can still study how it behaves. And once you start doing that across the different sections of the manuscript, the mystery deepens again, because the text isn't the only thing that changes from one cluster of pages to another. The imagery shifts too, from plants to stars to human bodies in water. The next question becomes whether those shifting pictures and the shifting word patterns are telling the same hidden story, or two entirely different ones. If you flip back to the beginning of the manuscript before the stars and the baths and the dense blocks of labels, something else dominates. Page after page after page of plants. By rough count, nearly half the surviving folios are taken up with what looks at first glance like a huge illustrated herbal. Each page typically shows one large plant, drawn in colour, with a block of text wrapped around it. Stems curl, leaves branch, roots twist into chunky, almost anatomical masses. Some plants get smaller marginal details, like detached leaves or seeds. Others sit above what look suspiciously like jars or containers, as if someone is telling you, this is what you boil, this is what you grind. If you didn't know anything else, you might assume you were looking at a typical medieval pharmacological manual. In the 1400s, those were everywhere. Monasteries, universities, and urban doctors all used herbals that paired images of plants with notes on where they grow, what they're called and what they're good for, wounds, fevers, digestion, love charms. From a distance, the Voynich botanical section fits right into that genre. Up close, it doesn't. The first thing that bothers botanists is simple. Most of these plants are not identifiable with any confidence. That's not because they're badly drawn. On the contrary, the illustrator is oddly consistent. Leaves of the same species are drawn with similar veins and margins. Root textures repeat. There's an internal logic, but when you try to map them onto real-world flora, the details drift. You might see a leaf that looks a bit like plantain, but it's attached to a stem that behaves more like a vine. The flower on top resembles something you'd expect on a thistle, but the root system sprawls into bulbous lobes you'd associate with a completely different family. It's as if the artist has taken pieces from multiple plants and stitched them together into a single composite organism that never actually grew in any real soil. This composite quality is everywhere. Flowers that look plausibly like violets sit on stalks that behave like lilies. A recognizable sunflower head will be perched over leaves that belong on a water plant. Some roots fan out into long-haired tendrils like ginseng or valerian. Others are carved into almost tool-like shapes, as if someone peeled the plant back to reveal wooden implements underneath. A few examples seem tantalizingly close to real species when you squint, but then a leaf count, a petal structure, or a branching pattern refuses to line up. Working botanists and historians of science have spent decades on this. They've approached it with plant taxonomy, with knowledge of medieval agriculture, with familiarity in trade routes and imported materia medica. The consensus is not that every plant is unrecognizable, but that as a set, the identifications are unreliable. Too many features are off, too many supposed matches require you to ignore blatant contradictions in favor of one or two convenient similarities. There are, broadly, a few ways to explain this. One possibility is stylization and memory. Medieval herbal illustrators often weren't painting from life. They were copying from older manuscripts, sometimes repeatedly over centuries. At each step, features could be exaggerated or simplified. Leaves become more schematic, roots more ornamental, colours more symbolic than realistic. By the time you get to the Voynich illustrator, you might be looking at a copy of a copy of a copy, the botanical equivalent of a phrase that's been whispered through too many rounds of telephone. But that familiar copying story doesn't quite solve it, because when we look at other European herbals from the same broad period, even the stylized ones, we can usually recognize a good portion of the plants. Their errors are noisy, not systematic. Voynich's oddities feel systematic. The same kinds of anatomical distortions reappear across the section. So researchers widen the net. Maybe these are not European plants at all, but a flora from somewhere else. The Eastern Mediterranean, Central Asia, even the Americas, if you're willing to push the dating and authorship in controversial directions. In that view, the composite features might be the result of someone trying to depict unfamiliar species using a visual vocabulary built on familiar ones. You see something new, you draw it with the leaves, stems and roots you already know how to picture. Another option is that the plants are symbolic, not attempts at literal portraits, but diagrams of properties. A root drawn like a liver might indicate a liver remedy. Leaves drawn with tear-shaped drops might suggest diuretic uses. Medieval herbals did sometimes lean into this doctrine of signatures mindset, where a plant's appearance hinted at its therapeutic use. If the Voynich botanical section is built on that logic, then what looks like biological distortion could actually be a visual encoding of how the author thought the plant behaved in the body. Then there's the more radical possibility that many of these plants are deliberately invented. Not in the sense that the artist had no idea what a plant looks like, but in the sense of constructing careful hybrids. You want to write about a preparation that uses 3 real herbs. Combine their leaves, flowers, and roots into one visual emblem. Anyone in the know would recognize which parts corresponded to which ingredients. To everyone else, it's just a fantastical specimen that doesn't exist, and therefore doesn't give away your recipe. To understand why that kind of deliberate disguise even enters the conversation, it helps to compare Voynich's plants to standard medieval herbals. In those, you'll usually see a more or less consistent pattern. 1 plant per page, drawn from the side, with roots on the ground line and flowers in the air. Names are often written above or beside the image in Latin or a vernacular language. The text will describe habitat, harvesting times, and medical uses in fairly predictable prose. Even when the art is awkward, the intention is transparent. Here is the plant, here is what we call it, Here is what it does. The Voynich botanical pages echo the layout, big central plant, text around it, but break away from the rest. There are no recognizable plant names. The text doesn't fall into obvious headings. Some pages include what look like cutaway views of roots inside jars or pots. Others show roots shaped almost like organs laid out for inspection. The colours are consistent across the section, but they don't map neatly onto realistic pigmentation. Blue-green leaves appear where you'd expect dull green. Roots that should be pale are painted in rich browns, or vice versa. Those pots and carefully rendered roots hint at practical intent. In many medical manuscripts, the most attention goes to the parts you actually harvest. The rhizomes you dry, the bark you strip, the tubers you boil. The Voynich illustrator clearly cared about those too. The underground parts are often more complex and emphasized than the visible stems and flowers, as if the business end of the plant lives beneath the soil. That, in turn, fuels the idea that we're looking at some kind of working manual, concerned with which parts to use and how to process them, even if the exact pharmacology is beyond our reach. At the same time, the persistent weirdness of the plants fuels a more guarded interpretation. If someone wanted to hide knowledge recipes, proprietary remedies, maybe even ritual plants from prying eyes, drawing impossible hybrids would be one way to do it. To your students, you teach the key. This leaf shape stands for this herb, this root texture for that one. To anyone else, the page is opaque, a herbal and a cipher at once. That tension runs through almost every discussion of the botanical section. On one side, the regular layout, the focus on roots and plant parts. The sheer labour involved in painting dozens of specimens all suggest a serious practical project, a real manual, even if it's built on ideas and species we no longer recognise. On the other side, the anatomical distortions, the composite features, the lack of clear matches, even when experts have tried for decades, give weight to the notion of deliberate obfuscation, or at least a visual language that isn't trying to be straightforwardly realistic. And because we can't read the labels, we're stuck hovering between those possibilities. The plants won't settle into being simply wrong or simply encoded. They just sit there, page after page, insisting that the book is about something tangible, roots, leaves, preparations, even as they refuse to line up neatly with any landscape we know. When you turn from them to the next cluster of pages, the stars and circles waiting in the astronomical section, that same question comes along. Is this the world faithfully recorded, or the world through a very strange, very private lens? When you turn that page, the roots and stems drop away and something else takes over. Circles, wheels, chains of stars marching around the edges like beads on a string. Roughly a dozen folios in the Voynich Manuscript are dominated by these circular diagrams. Some are simple, a central disc, rings around it, star-like shapes or flower-like rosettes filling the bands. Others are crowded with layers of nested circles, radial spokes, and little starbursts tucked into compartments like notes in a filing system. The overall impression is unmistakable. This is some kind of astronomical or astrological section. Medieval Europe loved this kind of imagery. Manuscripts from the same broad era are full of zodiac wheels, calendars of saints and feast days, diagrams of planetary motions and eclipses. To a reader familiar with that tradition, the Voynich diagrams feel eerily close to home. But as with the plants, almost nothing lines up cleanly once you lean in. Several pages show sequences that look very much like a zodiac series. There are figures that resemble rams, bulls, maybe a pair of fish, maybe a crab. Around them, rings of small text labels, as if each little star or segment is being named. In many medieval medical manuscripts you would expect exactly this. Zodiac signs linked to the months of the year, each one surrounded by labels for days, or for houses of the moon, or for body parts thought to fall under that sign's influence. Voynich's pages echo that format. A central emblem, then concentric rings packed with writing in the unknown script. Some of the labels repeat in patterns that feel a lot like month names or day counts. Short, regular words, turning up again and again at roughly even intervals, especially around what appear to be zodiac symbols. That regularity is one of the reasons many researchers think the book is not meaningless. A hoaxer drawing random gibberish wouldn't easily produce the kind of structured repetition that looks like Aries, April, May, even if we can't actually map the Voynich words to those concepts. At the same time, the specifics resist being pinned down. The creatures in the centre of these wheels almost match standard zodiac iconography, but they're often off just enough to inject doubt. A ram that doesn't quite ram, a scorpion that might simply be some other many-legged thing, a pair of human figures that could be Gemini but might just be two people drawn together. The colour palette is similar to European astrological manuscripts, greens, reds, yellows, but that's not much help. Those were the pigments most people had. And then there are the stars. Many pages in this section, and in adjacent ones, are sprinkled with small star-like shapes, usually with 8 or more points, often with a tiny coloured dot at the centre. Sometimes each star carries a little label. Sometimes they cluster around the edges of circular frames, as if each one marks a specific day, or a degree of the sky, or a station of some invisible journey. In other medieval works, this kind of layout is fairly well understood. You might have a circular calendar, where each day of the year sits in a tiny cell around the rim, or a diagram showing the so-called mansions of the moon, with each little division corresponding to a portion of the lunar cycle used in astrological predictions. Medical astrology in particular was fond of expressing the relationship between heavens and bodies in diagrams. Which days were good for bloodletting? Which phases of the moon favoured different treatments? Because we have those analogues, it's very tempting to say the Voynich astronomical section is doing something like that. The structure nudges you in that direction. The presence of zodiac-like figures near what look like radiating lists of labels strongly suggests calendars or horoscopes or some scheme of cyclic time. The repetition patterns in the text hint at recurring units, months, days, or some equivalent. Yet the temptation is exactly the problem. Medieval diagrams are deceptive. Two circles can look almost identical and mean completely different things depending on the text you no longer see. One copyist might draw a wheel to show the order of the planets from Earth. Another might use nearly the same layout to show the order of virtues and vices, or the stages of a disease. Without headings and commentary, shape alone can mislead you. With the Voynich manuscript, we don't just lack the commentary, we can't read the labels at all. So every time we point to a wheel and say, this is probably a calendar, we're making an educated guess based on visual similarity and structure, not on explicit evidence. That guess might be right. Many historians of science think the odds are good that at least part of this section is some form of astronomical or astrological handbook. But the line between resemblance and proof is thin, and the manuscript forces you to feel that difference. This is where the astronomy section becomes a test case for how we think about meaning in the book. On one hand, the circular layouts, the repeated motifs, the zodiac-like imagery, and the apparent cycles in the surrounding text all argue strongly against pure randomness. If someone wanted to create a meaningless hoax, they could have scribbled lines and shapes with none of this consistency. Instead, we see careful symmetry, nested structures, and labelling schemes that echo real medieval practices, even if they don't match any specific tradition we know. The diagrams look like they're tracking something, time, motion, influence, across repeated cycles. That something may be lost to us, but the intent to organize is hard to deny. On the other hand, these same features highlight how fragile our interpretations are when they rely solely on icons. A star symbol might mean an actual star, or it might be a marker for a recipe step, or a person, or a chant. A circle divided into 12 segments might be the zodiac, or a liturgical calendar, or 12 stages of a treatment, or 12 ingredients in a process. Without a key to the script, we're always in danger of reading our own expectations into the images and congratulating ourselves on finding what we already believe. So the astronomical section sits in an awkward middle ground. It doesn't resolve any of the big arguments about the manuscript, but it does shift the weight slightly. The wheels and stars and repeating labels make a strong cumulative case that the book is built on structured information, not on playful nonsense. At the same time, they warn us that structure alone is not enough. You can recognize a calendar-like pattern and still not know what, exactly, is being counted. And when you move from these stars and circles into the next cluster of pages, where human figures appear in pools and pipes and strange bathing contraptions, that tension only deepens. The heavens, the body, time, treatment, everything seems to be connected. But without the words, we're left tracing the outlines of a system that clearly exists, while knowing that its inner logic is still just out of reach. If the astronomical folios feel distant and abstract, the next pages feel almost uncomfortably intimate. Suddenly the manuscript fills with people, mostly women, or at least figures with rounded bodies and long hair, drawn without clothes. They stand in tubs, recline in basins, huddle in what look like barrels, or float in bulbous containers connected by a maze of green and blue pipes. Water, or something like water, seems to flow through these channels, filling and draining the baths in a looping, almost mechanical system. This cluster of folios is often called the balneological section, from balneum, the Latin word for bath. At first glance, it's tempting to say this must be about bathing cures, spa treatments, some kind of medical hydrotherapy. And there is a historical context that makes that sound plausible. Late medieval and early Renaissance Europe had a thriving culture of baths and mineral springs. Across the German-speaking lands in northern Italy, in Bohemia and beyond, people flocked to town baths and natural spas for cleanliness, but also for healing. Physicians wrote treatises explaining which baths were good for which ailments, which waters were hot and dry or cold and moist, in the language of humoral medicine. They diagrammed bathhouses, described sequences of immersion and rest, and sometimes linked particular springs to astrological conditions. Some of those texts are illustrated. We have manuscripts showing people soaking in communal pools, steam rising, attendants standing by. We have images of spring complexes with channels bringing specific mineral waters into separate tubs. If you place those next to the Voynich bathing pages, there is a family resemblance. Clusters of figures in tubs, water running through connected basins, a sense of organized treatment rather than casual washing. But, as always with this manuscript, the resemblances stop just where you want them to deepen. Medieval balneological diagrams typically come with clear labels, the name of the town, the source of the spring, the recommended therapy. In the Voynich pages there are labels, but they're in the unreadable script. Short words near individual figures, longer lines of text along the margins, or winding around the pipe-like structures. To a contemporary reader, those scribbles would have been the key that turned the pictures into instructions. To us, the pictures are all we have, and they're strange enough on their own. Some images show what look like transparent or half-open vessels, with the nude figures standing inside them, as if in glass vats. Elsewhere, bodies appear to be moving through pipe systems, as if the channels carry not only water but people or perhaps internal fluids represented as people. On a few pages there are objects that look like organ-like bulbs or swollen sacs, connected by branching tubes that have led some researchers to see them as highly stylized anatomical diagrams, blood vessels, lymph channels, maybe even reproductive organs reimagined as baths and pools. That anatomical reading leads into a second line of interpretation. Instead of depicting actual bathhouses, these pages might use bathing as a metaphor for processes inside the body. In medieval and early modern texts, It's not unusual to see bodily functions illustrated allegorically: furnaces for digestion, pipes for veins, cisterns for humours. If the author of the Voynich Manuscript wanted to show circulation or purification, or some imagined flow of vital forces, it would make sense to borrow the visual language of baths and channels that readers already knew from spa medicine. Then there is a third possibility, one that appears whenever pipes and vessels show up in medieval art: alchemy. Alchemical manuscripts from roughly the same centuries are filled with networks of flasks, retorts, alembics, and distillation coils. Liquids are heated, transformed, and cycled in and out of connected glassware. Sometimes human figures stand in for substances or stages of the work. Sometimes kings and queens sit in baths that represent dissolving metals. You can easily look at the Voynich figures sitting in round tubs, connected by coiling channels, and think of alchemical sublimation, separation, or washing of matter. Over the years, scholars and enthusiasts have proposed all of these readings: a handbook of spa cures for wealthy patients, a hidden anatomy text disguised as bathing scenes, an alchemical treatise coded in the language of baths, or even a spiritual allegory of purification and rebirth. Each theory can point to details that seem to fit: repeated motifs in the pipework, recurring configurations of tubs, clusters of similar-looking figures in similar positions. It all suggests that these pages aren't random doodles, they're systematic, even if we can't say what's being systematized. But the same problem that haunted the astronomical diagrams returns here in an even sharper form. The imagery repeats, yet the captions remain unreadable. We can see that particular tub and pipe arrangements recur across different folios, often with small variations. We can see that some figures are labelled and others are not, and that the labels around one configuration are very similar to those around another. That patterning implies technical content, perhaps a standard treatment repeated with slight modifications, or a single process applied to different substances, or the same organ depicted in several states. What we can't see is the semantic layer. Is this page telling someone, for this illness, bathe in such and such water under this star? Is it explaining, this channel draws off phlegm, this one returns blood to the liver? Is it instructing an alchemist, wash the material 3 times in this solution until it becomes green? The structure hints at all of these, but commits to none. And that ambiguity matters, because it affects how we imagine the intended audience. If this is a balneological handbook, perhaps the book was aimed at a physician working in or around a spa town, or at an educated layperson wealthy enough to travel for cures. If it's a metaphorical anatomy, maybe it was for teaching students of medicine, or even midwives, using familiar spa imagery to learn about the invisible interior. If it is alchemical, the audience shrinks again, a small circle of practitioners comfortable with veiled diagrams and encoded instructions. The level of abstraction in the drawings complicates the picture. These aren't straightforward depictions of a specific, identifiable bathhouse you could match to a real town. Nor are they clearly located in a particular social setting. There are no attendants, no physicians, no external architecture beyond the tub and pipe environment itself. That inward focus nudges interpretation toward an internal, perhaps even esoteric readership, people who already knew what these schemas represented and didn't need real-world scenery to orient them. At the same time, we have to be careful not to project our own categories too confidently onto the pages. The figures are mostly nude, but there's no explicit erotic charge. The poses are functional rather than suggestive: standing, sitting, stepping into or out of containers. Medieval art often treated nudity differently than modern viewers assume, especially in medical and religious contexts. To call these pages sexual says more about contemporary discomfort than about the intent of the original artist. Similarly, because we know about modern spas, or about later anatomical atlases, it's easy to see exactly those things here. But what we can actually say is more modest. The drawings consistently show human figures in relation to flowing media, liquid or something that behaves like liquid, inside a highly controlled, repeatable network of containers and channels. The same configurations recur, and the unknown text appears to label both people and pathways. All of that is solid observation. Whether the fluid is water, blood, spirit, or mercury is where speculation begins. So the balneological pages deepen the sense that the Voynich Manuscript is about processes, things that flow, change and cycle, whether in the sky, in the body, or in matter itself. They also deepen the gap between what we can see and what we can responsibly claim. We can trace the channels with our eyes, follow the little figures as they step from bath to bath, notice the words that echo like refrains around particular motifs. But until the script yields, those baths remain sealed. We're watching a carefully designed system at work, unable to say exactly what is being purified, transformed, or healed. After all that liquid motion, the manuscript begins to quiet down. The later folios shift away from full-page scenes and return to something more compact, almost modest. Many of these pages are grouped under what scholars sometimes call the pharmaceutical and recipe sections, though those labels are guesses more than translations. On the so-called pharmaceutical pages, the big, strange plants of the early section come back, but in a reduced, almost dismantled form. Instead of a single towering specimen per page, you get clusters of smaller botanical fragments. A root here, a leaf there, a flower or seed head, neatly isolated from its stem. They're arranged along the margins and between columns of text, almost like ingredients laid out on a workbench. Beside them, or beneath them, stand rows of jars. They're not photorealistic, of course. They're stylized little containers, variously shaped, some with necks and lids, some more like squat pots or apothecary flasks. If you leaf through herbal and medical manuscripts from the 15th century, you start to recognize a pattern. Practical medical books, especially those used by physicians and apothecaries, often show plants paired with the jars that would hold their preparations, syrups, unguents, distilled waters, powders. The Voynich jars fit into that visual tradition just enough to be familiar. They sit in columns or in small groups, sometimes with plant parts associated with particular containers, sometimes standing alone with text nearby. There's a sense that we're looking at a catalogue of substances, what later printed books would call a pharmacopoeia compressed onto vellum. Then, as we move even closer to the end, the illustrations thin out further. The final quires are mostly text, broken into short paragraphs, each one introduced by a star-shaped bullet. To a modern reader, it feels instantly recognizable. A list. Not continuous prose, not a narrative flowing from sentence to sentence, but discrete entries, each unit bounded and rhythmically similar on the page. That list-like formatting matters, because it tells us something about how the book may have been used. Medieval, medical, and technical manuscripts often end with collections of recipes, rules, or notes, condensed, working material that can be consulted quickly. A physician's notebook might have pages of, "For fever, do this. For wounds, mix that," each marked with a sign or initial to separate one recipe from the next. Household books, too, are full of short stand-alone instructions, dye recipes, dietary guidelines, charms, and prayers. The Voynich's final sections fit that pattern more than they resemble a philosophical treatise or a narrative text. Whatever those starred paragraphs say, their visual organization suggests practical compilations, the kind of thing you flip open to the right page, run your finger down the margin, and find the particular entry you need. And yet, as always, the specifics elude us. We can't read a single one of those recce. We only have their cadence on the page. That cadence, though, is more informative than it first appears. Even without understanding the words, scholars can study the scribal rhythm, how long typical paragraphs are, how frequently certain word shapes recur, where lines tend to break. In the pharmaceutical section, for instance, we can watch how text clusters around particular plant parts or jars, where the labels are shorter than the blocks of running script, whether certain recurring words appear in positions that look like units of measure, verbs, or ingredient names. The spacing and paragraphing become a kind of X-ray of the unknown language. Does the scribe favour evenly sized chunks, or do some entries expand over many lines? Do line endings coincide with syntactic units, or are they dictated purely by page width? Those are the kinds of questions that later statistical and linguistic studies would lean on, trying to decide whether this is natural language, an enciphered text, or an elaborate hoax following invented rules. Around the edges of these quieter pages, something else appears. Marginalia, on a few folios, most famously on the very last page. There are faint notes written in what looks like ordinary late medieval hands, using recognizable letters. They are fragmentary, hard to read, and heavily debated, but they're not in the Voynich script. Some look like they might be in a Romance language, perhaps heavily abbreviated vernacular. Others resemble German scribbles or even nonsense imitations of Latin. There's also a scattering of small additions elsewhere, corrections or extra letters near the main text, little insertions that seem to be later interventions. These scraps matter because they anchor the manuscript just a bit in the broader scribal world we can actually read. They suggest that at some point after the main text was written, later hands felt free to jot notes in the margins or on a blank area at the end. That is the behaviour you see with working books, manuscripts that live on desks, in chests, perhaps in a small library, where owners and readers annotate, cross-reference, or leave reminders for themselves. Taken together, the jars, the ingredient-like drawings, the star-marked paragraphs, and the marginalia point away from the idea of the Voynich manuscript as a pure display object. There is craftsmanship here, certainly. The vellum is decent quality. The inks are stable. The layout is deliberate. But the later sections read, visually, like a tool, a reference, a repository of procedures and substances, arranged so that someone could find and reuse them. At the same time, the way those final pages behave deepens the mystery instead of resolving it. If the end of the book had turned out to be, say, a colophon naming the author, the patron, and the purpose, this book of herbs and baths and stars was written in such and such a place, in such and such a year, for the benefit of, we would at least know what story we were inside. Instead, we have a closing section that looks exactly like the practical back matter of a medical or technical compendium, but in a script no one can read, for substances we can't securely identify, ending with marginal notes that seem to gesture toward familiarity and then dissolve under scrutiny. The structure says recipe book. The aesthetics say carefully planned compendium. The physical wear patterns and the palimpsest of later scribbles hint that someone at least treated it as a usable volume rather than a showpiece locked away. Yet the content remains sealed. These last quiet pages don't finally speak, they just change the register of the silence. After plants, stars, baths and flowing pipes, the manuscript closes with lists and fragments, as if to remind us that whatever knowledge it once held was not a single grand secret, but 100 small practical ones, each neatly starred, each patiently copied, each now just beyond our reach. If the manuscript itself refuses to give us a tidy ending, the historical record does much the same. For a physical object that still exists bound between covers in a modern library, the Voynich manuscript leaves a surprisingly faint trail through time. We can touch it, test it, photograph every page in high resolution, but if you try to follow it backward through the centuries, the line of evidence thins to almost nothing. Start with what can be dated without argument. When researchers at the University of Arizona radiocarbon dated tiny samples of the vellum in 2009, the results clustered tightly in the early 15th century, most likely between about 1404 and 1438. That doesn't tell us when the text and images were put down. Someone could, in theory, write on old parchment, but it gives us a solid "not earlier than" for the creation of the book as a physical object. We are, at the very latest, in the early 1400s. From there, you might expect a normal manuscript life, a colophon naming the scribe, a monastery library mark, a mention in some dusty inventory. Instead, we get silence. For perhaps 200 years, maybe more, the book moves through European history like a ghost. No dated ownership inscription we can trust, no clearly matching catalogue description, no contemporary scholar saying, "I saw a curious book filled with unknown writing and impossible plants." Our first real handhold does not come until the early 17th century, and even then it arrives sideways. In 1639, an erudite Prague physician named Johannes Marcus Marci sat down to write a long letter to an older colleague and friend, the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher in Rome. Along with the letter, Marci sent a strange manuscript, asking Kircher if he could read it. The covering note is preserved today, on brittle paper, its ink browned with age. It mentions that the enclosed book had once belonged, according to what Marci had been told, to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. It also repeats a bit of court gossip, that Rudolph had supposedly paid 600 ducats for it, believing it to be by the English philosopher Roger Bacon. That letter, dated and addressed, is the first secure documentary link in the Voynich chain of custody. We know, from those few pages of Latin prose, that by the 1630s the manuscript had reached the learned circles of Prague. We know it had already attracted speculation about its authorship, and we know that Marci thought Kircher, famed for his interest in ancient scripts and Oriental languages, might be able to do what no one in Bohemia had done, make it speak. Attached to that letter is a name that will loom large later on, Georg Barisch. Barisch was a Prague alchemist and collector, a man obsessed enough with the unreadable manuscript that, years before Marci wrote to Kircher, he had already sent excerpts of the script to Rome, begging for help. One of Barisch's earlier letters to Kircher survives. In it, he describes the book as a mysterious volume he cannot interpret, one he suspects hides great secrets. Between Barisch, Marci, and Kircher, we get our first little constellation of people around the manuscript. It sat in Barisch's collection, confusing him. It passed, upon his death, into the hands of Marci, his friend and fellow scholar. Marci mailed it to Kircher at the Collegio Romano, hoping the great decipherer would crack it. Those are not myths, they are documented steps, underwritten by ink, dates, and institutional archives. Everything else around that early modern moment has to be handled more carefully. Did Rudolph II really own the book, as Marci's letter reports? It is possible Rudolph did collect unusual manuscripts and curiosities in Prague. He was known to spend large sums on alchemical and astrological works, to patronize natural philosophers, to surround himself with things that promised hidden knowledge. A lavish, indecipherable codex would have fit his tastes beautifully. But the claim that he bought this particular manuscript for 600 ducats rests on Marci's report of hearsay. No independent record in Rudolph's inventories mentions a volume that clearly matches the Voynich. So historians can say, this tradition exists and it is plausible. They cannot say, Rudolph II definitely owned it, and here is the receipt. The same pattern holds for the supposed Roger Bacon connection. By the 17th century, Bacon had become a kind of legendary figure in the European imagination, a medieval wizard scientist, a man of forbidden optics and secret experiments. Attributing an anonymous, opaque manuscript to him was a way of elevating its cachet. It doesn't mean the attribution is correct. No reference to the Voynich appears in Bacon's own works, and the style and imagery of the manuscript sit more comfortably in the 15th century than in the 13th. Modern scholars treat the Bacon story as an instructive rumour rather than a fact. This is what it means to reconstruct a timeline from fragments. We rely on letters like Marcy's, on Barish's pleas to Kircher, on marginal notes and library inventories that might or might not refer to our book. Each scrap is a data point. Some line up neatly, others float nearby, suggestive but unanchored. In between them lie decades or centuries where the manuscript's location, owner, and status are entirely unknown. Those gaps are fertile ground for imagination, but also for confusion. Whenever the archival record goes quiet, secondary stories tend to rush in. Maybe the book spent time in a monastery, famous for herbal lore. Maybe it sat on the shelf of some shadowy alchemist. Maybe it travelled across borders in the luggage of diplomats, or was copied from an even older, lost original. None of those things are impossible. All of them are, at present, speculative. Without a dated inscription, a matching catalogue entry, or a corroborating letter, they remain narrative possibilities, not history. Separating those two categories, what is proven and what is merely likely, is especially important with the Voynich Manuscript, because the object itself encourages fantasy. It looks like a prop from a story about secret orders and forgotten sciences. It seems to demand a dramatic past, illicit scholars, coded correspondences, hidden sects. And historians are human. They feel the pull of a satisfying arc, just like everyone else. But when your subject has already attracted more than a century of wild claims, there is a real value in moving slowly, evidence first, instead of asking, what's the most exciting origin story we can tell? We start with, what pieces of paper actually survive, and what do they really say? Doing that produces a more modest but more reliable timeline. We can say with confidence that the vellum was prepared in the early 1400s. We can say that by the early 1600s, the manuscript was in Prague, in the possession of Baruch Barish, then Johannes Marcy. We can say that around 1665 or 1666, Marcy sent it to Athanasius Kircher in Rome. After that, we lose sight of it entirely for more than 200 years, until it reappears in the holdings of the Collegio Romano, and is eventually sold in the early 20th century to a Polish-Lithuanian book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich. Between those anchors there are chains of custody that are plausible but unproven. Perhaps the book really did pass through Rudolf II's palace. Perhaps it moved from imperial collections into private hands during the upheavals of the 30 Years' War. Perhaps it sat in Jesuit libraries, largely ignored, until someone in the 19th century quietly catalogued it as just another codex with unknown writing. Any of these could be true. None of them have yet been nailed down with the kind of documentation we would accept in a less glamorous case. Still, even this partial reconstruction has consequences. It tells us that by the time Voynich bought the manuscript in 1912, it had already been puzzling scholars for at least 300 years. It tells us that early modern intellectuals like Barish and Marcy treated it not as a prank, but as a serious, if infuriating object of study. And it brings into our field of view three key figures who will shape the next phases of the story: Rudolf II, the emperor around whom legends crystallize; Athanasius Kircher, the 17th century polymath, who collected unreadable scripts the way others collected fossils; and Wilfrid Voynich himself, whose discovery dragged this quiet codex out of a Jesuit chest and into the glare of 20th century speculation. In the next turns of the narrative, those personalities step out of the archival footnotes and onto the main stage. The manuscript does not speak, but emperors, Jesuits, and booksellers do. And the way they talk about it will shape how generations after them imagine what this stubborn little book might be. To understand why Rudolf II's name clings so stubbornly to the Voynich Manuscript, you have to picture the world he built around himself in Prague. Rudolf became Holy Roman Emperor in the late 16th century, and instead of ruling from Vienna, as his predecessors had done, he drew power inward and upward to Prague Castle. Over the decades, he turned it into something between a court, a laboratory, and a cabinet of curiosities. He collected paintings and mechanical automata, astronomical instruments and stuffed animals, alchemical glassware and strange stones. He invited mathematicians, astrologers, natural philosophers, and outright occultists to live and work under his protection. This was the court of Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer whose careful star measurements would later underpin Kepler's laws of planetary motion. It was the court of Johannes Kepler himself, hired originally as an imperial mathematician and horoscope caster. It was also the court where alchemists promised gold and elixirs of life in smoky laboratories where physicians tried to reconcile Galenic medicine with new chemical remedies, where astrology was not a parlour game, but a tool of statecraft. In that environment, an undeciphered manuscript filled with plants that don't quite exist, naked bodies in baths and tubes, and elaborate diagrams of stars and zodiac signs would not have been out of place. It would have been exactly the sort of object Rudolf liked to acquire, a book that hinted at secret knowledge, that seemed to sit at the crossroads of medicine, botany, and celestial influence. That is the world sitting behind Johannes Marcus Marcy's brief remark, written in 1639, that the mysterious book he was forwarding to Athanasius Kircher had once belonged to Rudolf II, and that the emperor had supposedly paid 600 ducats for it, thinking it was by Roger Bacon. Historians looking at that claim separate it into parts. The first part, could Rudolf reasonably have owned such a thing? Seems entirely plausible. We know from other documents that he paid high prices for manuscripts of alchemy, astrology, and natural magic, inventories of his Kunstkammer, his art and curiosity cabinets, list all manner of exotic objects and strange books. Rudolf's collecting habits leaned heavily toward things that were rare, obscure, or difficult to interpret. A lavish codex on fine vellum, written in an unknown script, decorated with enigmatic diagrams and herbal images, would have fit seamlessly on his shelves beside grimoires and alchemical treatises. The second part, did he specifically pay 600 ducats for this book, believing it to be a work of Roger Bacon, is more fragile. The amount is large, but not unimaginable for a wealthy collector in search of something special. The Bacon attribution, as we've seen, was already circulating in learned circles by Marcy's time. But crucially, Marcy is not reporting a transaction he witnessed. He is passing along what he calls the rumour he had heard in Prague. And when we look for corroboration outside that rumour, we don't find it. No surviving imperial account book lists a purchase that can confidently be matched to the Voynich Manuscript. No description in Rudolf's detailed inventories says, in effect, a great parchment book of unknown letters, with many strange plants and stars. There are entries for alchemical and astrological books, but none whose wording clearly points to this one. So we end up with a statement that sits in the grey zone between history and tradition. Marcy's letter is real. Rudolf's taste for esoteric works is documented. The environment of Prague makes the story inherently believable. But direct evidence that the Voynich manuscript was in Rudolf's hands is missing. That gap matters. What makes the Rudolf story hard to ignore is how well his Prague resonates with the manuscript's themes. Under Rudolf, the boundaries between legitimate science, speculative philosophy, and explicit occultism were porous. Astronomy and astrology were practiced by the same people. Chemistry blurred into alchemy. Herbal medicine overlapped with magical properties of plants. Physicians used baths, mineral waters, and balneological therapies as part of serious treatment regimes. If you leaf through the Voynich pages with that world in mind, the fit is tempting. Herbal diagrams could be a learned but idiosyncratic pharmacopoeia. The zodiac and star charts might speak to medical astrology, where the positions of the heavens guided bloodletting, surgery, and timing of remedies. The pages of nude women in flowing interconnected baths start to look less like fantasy and more like a stylized map of humoral balance, waters and bodily fluxes, a kind of visual physiology in dialogue with spars, springs and alchemical vessels. That resonance makes it easy to imagine the codex sitting on a table in some dim room of Prague castle, surrounded by brass astrolabes and distillation apparatus. But resonance is not proof. It's pattern recognition reinforced by the fact that we know Rudolf's court really did host men who thought and worked along these lines. When we ask what hard evidence we have for linking the Voynich to Rudolf II, the answer is still one remark in Marcy's letter, written decades after Rudolf's death, plus the more general knowledge that by the 1630s the book was in Prague in the hands of men who moved in learned circles shaped by his legacy. Everything beyond that, how it would have entered Rudolf's collection, who brought it to him, whether it left the court during his lifetime or later, is inference. This is where another danger creeps in. Once a mysterious object gets tied, even loosely, to a famous collector, that association starts to bend the questions we ask. If you assume Rudolf owned the manuscript, you are more likely to assume it must be spectacular in exactly the way his other treasures were. You begin looking for imperial scale secrets, a lost universal cipher, a masterwork of some legendary sage. The story of the owner inflates the imagined importance of the thing. With the Voynich Manuscript, that inflation has been powerful. Rudolf II's unreadable book sounds much grander than a strange 15th century codex that turned up in 17th century Prague. It suggests an imperial commissioning, a network of occult advisors, deliberate secrecy at the highest levels. All of those scenarios are possible, none are demonstrated. Yet they seep into popular writing, exhibitions, documentaries, until the Rudolf connection feels more solid than the single footnote on which it rests. At the same time, it's difficult to entirely set Rudolf aside. His court really did create a gravitational centre for the exact kinds of practices the Voynich seems to gesture toward. His patronage helped shape Prague into a magnet for astrologers, alchemists, and heterodox thinkers. The manuscript's earliest known circle of owners, Baresch, Marcy, their colleagues, lived in the long shadow of that court, in a city whose intellectual life had been tuned, for a generation, to the frequencies of hidden knowledge and encoded nature. So the Rudolf story persists, half anchored in documentation, half in the patterns our minds like to see. It remains a legend that historians keep at arm's length, labelled plausible but unproven, even as it continues to dominate how the broader public imagines the manuscript's early history. In that, it is a perfect microcosm of the Voynich problem itself. A small, solid core of evidence wrapped in layers of interpretation, rumour and desire for a satisfying narrative. As the manuscript leaves Prague behind and disappears into Jesuit collections, that dynamic will only intensify. The book itself stays the same. The stories around it keep changing. By the time the manuscript steps out of Rudolf's long shadow, Europe has changed completely. The 30 Years' War has broken over Bohemia and rolled back and forth across Central Europe, leaving famine, disease and political realignment in its wake. Confessional boundaries harden. Institutions that had seemed permanent crumble or are absorbed. Libraries are broken up, looted, or quietly transferred to safer hands. Somewhere in this slow chaos, the Voynich Manuscript moves from the desks of Prague physicians and natural philosophers into the orbit of the Society of Jesus. We can see only a few points along that path. When Georg Baresch dies, the book passes to Johannes Marcus Marcy, his friend and fellow physician. Marcy, already elderly and ill, sends it to Athanasius Kircher in Rome, probably in the late 1630s or early 1640s, accompanied by the famous Rudolf letter. Then the trail goes faint. Kircher was a Jesuit and one of the order's best-known polymaths. He wrote about everything from Egyptian hieroglyphs to volcanoes, from magnetism to ancient languages. He also received a constant stream of curiosities and puzzles from correspondents across Europe, who hoped he might unlock them. The Voynich Manuscript arrives as one more enigmatic object in that accumulating tide. What happens next is frustratingly opaque. No surviving letter from Kircher comments on the book, no marginal notes in the manuscript, no scribbled attempts at decipherment, no catalogue entry in his own hand. All we know is that by the time he dies in 1680, his personal papers and collection form the core of the Collegio Romano's museum and library. The Jesuit order, unlike many princely courts, tended to centralize its intellectual property. Manuscripts and books that came into a famous Jesuit's possession could be claimed as institutional assets after his death. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Society of Jesus was suppressed in some states, restored in others, expelled, refounded, and constantly negotiating with shifting governments, its libraries were moved, hidden, recatalogued, and occasionally sold. The Voynich Manuscript spent more than 2 centuries somewhere in that institutional maze. Its pages were safe, but its story went quiet. When Jesuit scholars in Rome inventoried their holdings, they often focused on texts with obvious theological, philosophical, or philological value. An unreadable codex in an unknown script, with no clear author and no apparent doctrinal content, could easily sink to the back of a shelf, noted only as Liber Ignotus, or book in unknown characters. The next clear glimpse comes in the late 19th century, when we find the manuscript in the private library of the Jesuit Villa Mondragone in Frascati, near Rome. The college there, run by the Society of Jesus, had accumulated a substantial collection of manuscripts and early printed books. Many of them had trickled down from the Collegio Romano and other Jesuit houses. At Villa Mondragone, the Voynich Manuscript is no longer a personal oddity owned by a single scholar. It is a quiet asset of a religious order that by this point is perpetually under financial strain. Maintaining schools, missions, and properties costs money. Manuscripts can be sold. Enter Wilfrid Voynich. Voynich was a Polish-Lithuanian bookseller and political exile who had made a career out of dealing in rare manuscripts and early printed works. By 1912, he was well known in antiquarian circles, with a particular talent for persuading underfunded institutions to part with items they no longer prioritized. That year he visited Villa Mondragone, where the Jesuits had discreetly decided to sell off portions of their library to reduce debts. Somewhere in a trunk or cabinet of unsorted materials, Voynich was shown a thick vellum codex in a worn binding, written in unknown characters, illuminated with strange plants and zodiac diagrams. The story he later told of immediately sensing its importance, of recognizing something unprecedented, is hard to verify, and like the Rudolph tale, it has probably grown in the retelling. What we can say is that he bought it, along with a number of other volumes, and took it away. From that moment, the book acquires the name we use today. It is not the Rudolph Manuscript or the Kircher Codex. It becomes, in auction catalogues, correspondence, and eventually scholarship, the Voynich Manuscript, simply because Wilfrid Voynich was the one who pulled it back into the light. Voynich's role in the manuscript's modern life is hard to overstate. He was not a dispassionate archivist. He was a dealer with a strong sense of drama and a clear financial incentive to make his discoveries seem as extraordinary as possible. He had the vellum radiocarbon tested as far as contemporary methods allowed. He commissioned photographs. He prepared facsimiles. He circulated descriptions to scholars at major universities, always stressing the mystery: unknown script, unknown language, unknown author, unknown content. And it worked. Early 20th century academics who saw the book were intrigued, even if they weren't sure what to make of it. Cryptographers, medievalists, historians of science all took a look. Some found the script too regular and the illustrations too coherent to be a random fantasy. Others were instantly suspicious, wondering if the unknown writing might be a clever hoax designed to fleece a gullible collector, perhaps even Rudolf II himself. That mix of excitement and skepticism is the beginning of modern Voynich studies. Before Voynich, the manuscript had been a local curiosity in Prague, then a buried puzzle in Jesuit archives. After Voynich, it becomes a problem for the international scholarly community. Articles appear, private attempts at decipherment proliferate. The first competing theories about its nature as cipher, constructed language, or nonsense take shape. But Voynich's promotional flair also planted some thorns that researchers still have to work around. To help market the book, he leaned heavily on the most dramatic parts of its backstory: the supposed Roger Bacon authorship, the Rudolf rumour, the connection to Kircher. These claims, often framed in strong terms to attract buyers or patrons, seeped into public consciousness as quasi-facts. The more often they were repeated, the harder it became, even for careful readers, to separate what was securely documented from what was speculative. This is where public interest cuts both ways. On one hand, broad fascination brings resources. Voynich's efforts led to photographs being made, transcripts being attempted, experts being drawn in. Over the decades, that attention would eventually fund high-resolution imaging, radiocarbon dating that fixed the vellum in the early 1400s, and the careful conservation that now preserves the codex in Yale's Beinecke Library. On the other hand, once a mystery book becomes a minor cultural phenomenon, the signal-to-noise ratio drops. Bold theories, sweeping narratives, and imaginative reconstructions attract more attention than cautious archival work. Owners' names, Rudolf, Kircher, Voynich, turn into magnets for myth. Each news story about what the manuscript must be makes it a little harder to see the thin, stubborn line of actual evidence. That is why ownership history matters so much for evaluating hoax and authenticity claims. A hoax is not just an object, it is a performance. It requires a maker, an intended victim, a context in which the deception makes sense. If the Voynich manuscript were an elaborate forgery created in the early 17th century to trick Rudolf II, then its presence in Jesuit collections, its transfer to Kircher's circle, and its quiet sleep in Villa Mondragone all have to fit that story. The timeline, the materials, the documented hands it passed through, each becomes a constraint. Conversely, if it is a genuine 15th century compilation that drifted through Central European scholarly networks before landing in Rome, the same chain of custody supports that more modest but still remarkable reading. The vellum's radiocarbon date, the binding style, the marginalia in Latin hand, the letters of Barish and Marcy, the Jesuit inventories, the 1912 sale to Voynich, together they form a kind of scaffolding. Within that scaffolding, many interpretations of the text are still possible. Outside it, the more extravagant stories begin to strain. By the time Wilfrid Voynich dies in 1930, the manuscript that now bears his name has left the controlled obscurity of Jesuit shelves and entered a new kind of wilderness, the open marketplace of ideas, theories, and attempted solutions. His widow Ethel will guard it for decades more, loaning access to a very few researchers. The stage is set. The book has owners, a name, a set of tantalizing historical hints, and a growing reputation as the text no one can read. Into that charged atmosphere walks William Newbold, whose confidence in his own decipherment will show just how blinding the lure of meaning can be. William Romain Newbold was not a crank on the fringes. He was a respected professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, with a background in classical languages and a serious interest in cryptography. When Ethel Voynich allowed him to study the manuscript in the 1910s, she wasn't handing it to a random enthusiast. She was entrusting it to someone who looked, on paper, exactly like the kind of person who might actually crack it. Newbold approached the Voynich manuscript with a particular mix of tools and assumptions. He knew ciphers. He knew medieval philosophy. He believed deeply in the Roger Bacon story that Wilfred Voynich had been circulating. And above all, he believed that human genius, when properly applied, could penetrate even the most stubborn veil of secrecy. For a while, it seemed like he had done it. Newbold's central claim was that the visible Voynich writing was not the real text at all. The looping Voynichese characters, he argued, were just a scaffold, a cover script hiding a microscopic shorthand embedded within the strokes themselves. According to his theory, each tiny irregularity, each apparent crack or jagged edge in the ink, actually represented miniature Latin letters compressed into almost invisible form by an astonishing 13th century mind. When he examined the manuscript under a magnifying glass, he thought he could see them, little hooks and curls inside the broader strokes of each character. To Newbold, those tiny shapes were not the roughness of quill on vellum or the natural breakdown of ink over centuries. They were intentional micro-letters, forming abbreviated Latin phrases. Decode those phrases, he said, and the manuscript opens. From this starting point, he built a dazzling structure. In lectures and ultimately in a posthumous book, he presented translations that seemed almost too good to be true. The astronomical diagrams, he claimed, contained descriptions of distant galaxies and nebulae visible only with telescopic magnification, centuries before Galileo. The biological drawings, he said, concealed observations about human reproduction and cellular structure that anticipated modern microscopy. All of this, Newbold argued, proved that Roger Bacon, or some equally extraordinary medieval scientist, had somehow combined advanced optics with an unprecedented cipher system. To readers in the 1920s, still intoxicated by stories of lone geniuses and hidden knowledge, it sounded thrilling. Here was a coherent narrative, a known medieval polymath, a mysterious codex, secret discoveries in astronomy and biology, all wrapped in a code that only a modern professor had finally managed to break. Journals published his results. Public lectures drew crowds. For a brief time, Newbold's solution was treated by many as the long-awaited key. Then people started looking more closely. The first cracks did not appear in the manuscript. They appeared in Newbold's method. Cryptographers and medievalists who tried to follow his decoding process discovered that it wasn't really a process at all, in the usual sense. It was an intricate chain of interpretive moves, each depending on the last, with very little independent check at any step. The microscopic shorthand itself was the weak link. Other scholars examined the pages under better magnification and saw what conservators and paleographers now recognize immediately. The so-called micro-letters were just artifacts. When iron gall ink ages, it can craze and flake. When a quill lifts slightly or the scribe writes faster, strokes become uneven. Vellum has its own surface irregularities, under magnification. All of these combine into tiny cracks and curls that are tempting to read as intentional shapes, but are not. If the microscopic letters weren't real, the entire cipher system collapsed. Without them, the decoded Latin phrases evaporated, because they had never been generated by a repeatable rule set. They had been assembled through constant reinterpretation, spotting a fragment here, stretching an abbreviation there, adjusting the reading when it began to drift from what Newbold felt the passage ought to say. Critics pointed out another problem. Newbold's supposed Baconian science was suspiciously modern. His readings turned the 13th century into a mirror of the early 20th. Telescopes that functioned like contemporary lenses, embryology that echoed recent discoveries. It was as if the manuscript had been waiting for 600 years to confirm the worldview of a professor in 1919. That is the hallmark of confirmation bias. You begin with a strong expectation here that Roger Bacon was the author and that he anticipated modern science. Then you unconsciously bend ambiguous data until it fits the story you already believe. Newbold undoubtedly worked in good faith, but once he committed to the idea that the Voynich concealed microscopic writing, Every speck of ink damage became a probable letter, and every sequence of probable letters could be finessed into a meaningful sentence. The episode became a cautionary tale very quickly. In 1931, just a few years after Newbold's death, his own colleague John Manley published a thorough demolition of the microscopic shorthand theory. Manley showed that different scholars looking at the same ink cracks saw different letters. He demonstrated that Newbold quietly allowed himself multiple options at each step until he reached a sentence that aligned with what he hoped to find. He argued persuasively that the whole edifice was a house built on random noise. For later Voynich researchers, Newbold's story had a sobering effect. It reminded cryptographers that visual pattern seeking is a dangerous guide when the signal is weak and the stakes are high. It reminded historians that enthusiasm for a hero figure like Roger Bacon can warp judgment. And it reminded everyone that with a text as opaque as the Voynich, you can often extract some kind of meaning if you're willing to adjust your rules flexibly enough. The challenge is not to find meanings, it is to find methods that are constrained, testable, and replicable by others. In that sense, Newbold's failure became strangely productive. Future attempts at decipherment were under more pressure to publish clear algorithms and statistical tests, not just narratives. Proposed readings had to survive independent checking. Claims that the script hid microscopic letters, steganographic images, or other invisible layers now faced a higher bar. Extraordinary evidence, not just suggestive photographs. The episode also forces a subtler distinction that matters in any long-running mystery. There is a difference between sincere scholarship that overreaches and wishful decoding that never submits to critique. Newbold belongs firmly in the first category. He spent years with the manuscript, built a complex theory, exposed it to his peers, and once the criticisms landed, his solution did not survive. That is how scholarship is supposed to work, even when the conclusion is uncomfortable. And even a failed attempt leaves traces that are useful. By showing that the page-level ink irregularities are consistent with aging, not hidden micro-writing, Newbold's critics narrowed the field. They gave us one more thing the Voynich almost certainly is not. It is not a palimpsest of microscopic Latin shorthand documenting pre-Galilean astronomy and embryology. Every serious misstep like this closes off a branch of the search tree. It doesn't tell us what the manuscript says, but it helps map the border between what is imaginable and what is plausible. When we watch Newbold, confident and ingenious, lose his way in a forest of ink cracks and expectations, we get a clear warning. With a book like this, the human desire to see meaning everywhere is both our greatest asset and our most persistent trap. The next people to tackle the manuscript would bring a different set of tools. They were used to dealing with hard problems under pressure, and they knew better than most how easy it is to fool yourself when you want a solution too badly. They came from war rooms and code offices, not cloistered studies, and when they looked at the Voynich manuscript, they saw something very different from microscopic Latin letters. They saw a problem. For the generation that lived through the Second World War, ciphers weren't romantic puzzles. They were life and death logistics. Break a code, ships survive the Atlantic. Fail, and they sink. Out of that world came a group of people who were very, very good at telling the difference between a real encrypting system and wishful thinking. Some of them ended up looking at the Voynich manuscript. The most famous was William Friedman, the US Army's leading cryptanalyst, who helped break Japanese systems before and during the war and helped shape modern code-breaking afterwards. Others in his circle, people like his wife Elizabeth, a brilliant cryptanalyst in her own right, and colleagues trained in the new science of statistics, took an interest as well. They were brought in precisely because they had track records. They had cracked hostile ciphers under far worse conditions. If anyone could tell whether the Voynich was just a code, it was them. They approached it the way they would any unknown system. Not with narratives about medieval geniuses, but with tests. One of the first questions you ask in cryptanalysis is simple. What familiar patterns do you see? If the Voynich was written in a European language enciphered with a classical substitution system, the kind of method actually used in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, then certain signatures ought to appear. In a basic monoalphabetic substitution, each plaintext letter is swapped consistently for some other symbol. Underneath, the language doesn't change. The most common letters stay common. The relative frequencies of bigrams and trigrams, 2- and 3-letter combinations, stay roughly the same. The internal structure of words still reflects the underlying grammar. You can attack a cipher like that statistically, even if you don't know the language at first. Friedman and others ran those checks. They looked at letter frequencies. They looked at the shapes of words. They tried to segment the text into probable vowels and consonants to see whether any familiar pattern, Latin, German, Italian, would emerge through the veil of substitution. It didn't. Voynich's characters have frequency distributions that are suspiciously clean, more regular and even than typical European languages. Word lengths cluster in a narrow band. There are comparatively few very short words and very few very long ones. Certain glyphs hardly ever appear doubled, or in particular positions. Some sequences of symbols recur with minor variations, like a word and its dialectal forms, but not in a way that maps neatly onto known morphology. This pushed the codebreakers toward more complex hypotheses. Maybe it wasn't a simple one-to-one substitution. Maybe it was a polyalphabetic cipher, where the symbol used for a given letter shifts according to some key. Maybe it used homophones, multiple symbols standing for the same plaintext letter, to flatten the frequency distribution. Maybe there were nulls inserted, extra characters with no meaning at all. They tried those models too. They looked for periodicities that might reveal a repeating key. They searched for the telltale traces of polyalphabetic systems they knew from Renaissance Europe and from their own wartime experience. Again, nothing fitted cleanly. You could massage parts of the text into looking like one system or another, but the pattern would break when you shifted sections or when you applied the same rule somewhere else. Here, another problem reared its head, one that makes the Voynich much more difficult than wartime traffic. In a typical military cipher, you know something about the underlying language. You might even know a lot. Common phrases, expected formats, stereotyped reports. That gives you footholds. Even partial plaintext guesses, attack at dawn, weather report, command, can anchor a solution. With the Voynich, you have none of that. You don't know what language lies beneath, if any. You don't know whether there is a single consistent cipher system, or different systems for different sections, or encryption layered over some kind of shorthand. You don't even know if the script represents sounds at all, or if it's encoding something like syllables or concepts or numbers. Every unknown multiplies the search space. Unknown script type. Unknown language group. Unknown time period of composition. Unknown cipher family, and a manuscript whose sections, botanical, astronomical, balneological, recce keys, might each follow their own rules, or share only some of them. What looks like one problem could be 6. Friedman understood this. In the 1950s, he convened what came to be called the first study group on the Voynich, pulling in other codebreakers and linguists to pool their skills. They didn't produce a translation. What they produced was more modest, and, in some ways, more important, a set of constraints. They showed that the text behaves in ways that are strongly consistent with some kind of systematic generation process. It has word-like units, line-based structure, and non-random repetition patterns. It fails many tests of pure gibberish. But they also showed that it does not behave like a straightforward enciphered version of any known European language, using known classical ciphers. Whatever is going on is either more exotic or not a cipher in the ordinary sense at all. This is where the phrase "looks statistical" becomes treacherous. A page of randomly hit typewriter keys looks chaotic, and statistics confirm that it is. A page of normal prose shows clear patterns in letter and word frequencies, and statistics confirm that too. But you can engineer an in-between, structured nonsense generated by rules that imitate the surface features of language without encoding any underlying meaning. You can write out syllable-like strings according to a template, making sure common clusters repeat at plausible intervals. You can rotate and slightly alter words so that they feel like inflected forms. You can constrain where certain symbols appear so they act like vowels or consonants. To a first pass, the result will look statistical, in the sense that it will fail simple tests for random noise and pass simple tests for structure. That is exactly what makes the Voynich so slippery. Many of its properties could arise from meaningful text passing through an unknown cipher. But many of those same properties could arise from a system designed quite deliberately to imitate meaningful text. Without an independent key, without some external anchor telling you, this glyph equals this sound in this language, you can't tell those two worlds apart just by counting. Cryptanalysis without a key is still possible, but its power is limited. What it can do, and what the war-era analysts did, is close doors. They could say the Voynich is almost certainly not a simple monoalphabetic substitution of Latin. It does not behave like ordinary enciphered German or Italian under the classical methods. It does not match known historical cipher manuals from the 15th and 16th centuries. If it is a code, it is highly unorthodox for its time, or deliberately obfuscating its own statistics, or both. What they could not do was produce a unique, verifiable decryption. Every time someone proposed a scheme, it required so many special allowances, so many exceptions, local rules and contextual adjustments, that it began to look less like decipherment and more like Newbold's microscript, only written in mathematics instead of ink cracks. By the late 20th century, the era of paper messages and hand-broken ciphers was fading. Computers, new branches of linguistics, and large text corpora were beginning to offer a different toolkit. The codebreakers of the war years had done what they could. They had pushed the problem to its boundaries, shown where simple explanations fail, and left behind a careful map of statistical oddities. The next wave of researchers would follow those contours with more powerful instruments, asking a slightly different question. Not just, could this be a cipher, but does this behave like language at all? When computers entered the story, that question became testable in a new way. Instead of squinting at tables of symbol counts by hand, you could feed the entire manuscript, every line, every glyph, into a machine and ask it to do the counting for you. Not just how often each character appears, but how often different words show up, how they cluster by page and section, how predictable the next symbol is given, the ones that came before. This is where modern linguistics and statistics meet the Voynich. Every known language has a kind of fingerprint in its word frequencies. A small number of words, the and of in English, are used constantly. A much larger number are rare. When you plot this, you get a characteristic curve, often close to what's called Zipf's law. The most frequent word appears about twice as often as the second most frequent, 3 times as often as the third, and so on. The exact shape varies across languages, but the broad pattern is surprisingly robust. Researchers did this with the Voynich text. Whatever the underlying script represents, they treated each space-delimited unit as a word and counted. The result was unsettlingly familiar. The Voynich doesn't behave like random noise, where each symbol is equally likely and the distribution is flat. Its words follow a long-tailed curve very similar to that of real languages. There are a few very common tokens and many that appear only once or twice. When you look at character-level statistics, how often each glyph appears, how often glyphs follow each other, you see the same thing. Some sequences are common, some are rare, some are effectively forbidden. This is what linguists call non-uniform, non-random structure. Entropy measures tell a similar story. Entropy, in this context, is a way of talking about how predictable a stream of symbols is. If you know nothing about what's coming next, entropy is high. If you can guess the next character or word with some confidence based on what you've already seen, entropy is lower. Real languages tend to land in a particular band, not too predictable, not too chaotic. When you compute those values for Voynich, they come out close to those of natural language. Not identical, and there are differences if you drill into the details, but well within the range you'd expect for something produced by rules, not by coin flips. You see it in subtler patterns as well. Certain glyphs prefer to appear at the beginnings of words, others in the middle, others at the end. Some character clusters repeat with minor variations like a root with different endings. There are families of words that differ only by one letter, distributed across the text in ways that feel grammatical. You can model these as if there were phonotactic rules, constraints on what sounds can occur where, and the fit is surprisingly good. Then, when you cluster the text by section, another layer emerges. Take just the botanical pages and run a statistical analysis on their word usage. Then do the same for the astronomical diagrams, or the balneological sections with the bathing women, or the final pages that look like recipes and lists. When you compare those profiles, they differ in consistent ways. Certain words and glyph sequences are much more common in one section than another, as if you were looking at topic-specific vocabulary. That's exactly what you'd expect in a real book. A medieval herbal written in Latin uses different words in its plant descriptions than a treatise on astronomy or a collection of household recipes. Each genre has its own technical terms and habits. The Voynich seems to have that kind of internal structure too. You can even train simple machine learning classifiers to guess which section a line comes from, based only on the pattern of glyphs with accuracy better than chance. All of this is why you often hear that the Voynich has grammar-like behavior. It has repeatable patterns, preferred orders, clusters that act like morphological variants. The probabilities of sequences are constrained in much the same way that syllables and morphemes are constrained in real languages. But here the same warning returns. Structure is not meaning. You can build a system that mimics these statistical fingerprints without encoding any underlying language at all. If you design a recipe for generating pseudo-words, say, choose one symbol from set A, then one or two from set B, maybe add a tail from set C, you will automatically get preferred positions, forbidden combinations, and word families. If you bias your choices according to a Zipf-like distribution, you'll get something that passes a word frequency test. If you tweak the recipe for different sections, slightly different symbol sets, slightly different biases, you'll even get convincing topical clusters. Many of the modern models of Voynich, including those that simulate it using Markov processes or other generative rules, demonstrate exactly this. You can reproduce a lot of language-like statistics without having a language underneath. The same dataset can support multiple narratives. One researcher's algorithm might treat the text as an enciphered Romance language. Another's might treat it as auto-generated nonsense with constraints. Both can claim truthfully that their outputs match certain statistical features. That's the limit of this kind of analysis. It's very good at saying what the text is not. It is very unlikely to be pure random trash. It is not just arbitrary scribbles. Its structure is too consistent, too rule-bound, to be produced by a bored scribe making marks. But those same tools are much weaker at saying what the text positively is. Is it a cipher over meaningful language, a constructed language with its own internal grammar? A sophisticated hoax that imitates linguistic structure? On their own, the numbers don't decide. They're also only as good as the data you feed them. The Voynich text we analyse today isn't abstract truth. It's a transcription, someone's best guess at how to map handwritten glyphs into a standardized character set. Over the years, several transcription alphabets have been proposed, the most famous being the EVA system used in many studies. But there are ambiguities on the page. Is this two glyphs or one ligature? Are these shapes distinct, or just handwriting variants of the same symbol? Do we segment here, or treat this as part of the previous word? Those choices matter. Merge two glyphs into one, and you change the frequency counts. Split a single ambiguous sign into two, and you alter the apparent entropy. Decide that a particular flourish is meaningful rather than decorative, and you add a new symbol to the system. Different transcribers can produce slightly different digital texts, and some statistical findings turn out to depend on those choices. A regularity that looks very strong in one transcription can weaken or disappear in another. Because of that, serious researchers tend to be cautious about global claims. They test their conclusions across multiple transcriptions. They look for patterns that are robust to these variations, the ones that survive when you change your assumptions. Many of the broad findings do survive: non-randomness, section-specific clustering, grammar-like distributions. But the finer details, the exact strength of a given pattern, whether two-word families are really distinct or artifacts of notation, remain open to debate. Into this landscape, over the past few decades, have come waves of decipherments. Sometimes the claim is that the text is an abbreviated form of Latin, or a dialect of Old Czech, or a form of Hebrew, or a lost Romance language from northern Italy. Sometimes it is said to be an artificial language, or a cipher over a natural one, or even a glossolalia script encoding no spoken tongue at all. Almost always the proposer brings some statistics, correlations, recurring alignments between Voynich words and their proposed plaintext, measures of fit that look persuasive in isolation. Specialists, by and large, remain unconvinced. The recurring problems are familiar. The proposed readings usually require very flexible rules. A single glyph can stand for multiple sounds or letters. The same plaintext letter can be encoded in many different ways. Silent characters appear and disappear as needed. Apparent translations can't be reproduced independently. When other researchers apply the same rules to new pages, the sense breaks down. Perhaps most tellingly, these systems almost never make risky predictions, readings that can be checked against independent historical facts. A genuine breakthrough would look different. It would not just match the internal statistics of the text, that much we already have. It would anchor those statistics to something outside the manuscript. The ideal scenario, the dream of every Voynich researcher, would be the discovery of a bilingual, another document with the same script paired with a known language, the way the Rosetta Stone paired Egyptian hieroglyphs with Greek. Even a short, clearly parallel passage, a prayer, a standard formula, a clearly labelled diagram that can be matched to known examples could supply the crucial foothold. Short of that, a convincing solution would have to do several things at once. It would need a decoding system that is simple enough to state clearly and apply mechanically, without special pleading for each page. It would need to generate readings that are grammatical and meaningful in some attested language, not just in fragments but across long stretches of text. It would have to explain the observed statistics, word frequencies, section differences, positional rules as natural consequences of its mechanism, not obstacles to be worked around. And it would have to make verifiable predictions, for instance, that a particular unlabeled plant should correspond to a specific species, or that a star chart encodes a particular dated configuration which can then be checked. Until something like that appears, modern linguistics and statistics leave us in a curious middle ground. They tell us that the Voynich is not a trivial fake dashed off without thought. They tell us that its text behaves in many respects like language. They also tell us that clever rule-based nonsense can behave that way too, and that our tools are not yet sharp enough to cut cleanly between those possibilities. Which brings the debate back to its fundamental fork: hoax, cipher, or lost language. At this fork in the road, people tend to gather into four camps. One says the Voynich is a hoax, an elaborately decorated fake designed to impress a rich buyer. Another says it's an enciphered text, real language hidden behind a code we haven't cracked. A third says it's a constructed language, an invented tongue with its own rules, maybe used by a tiny circle of initiates. The last says it's a natural language we simply don't recognize anymore, a dialect with no surviving relatives, written in a script that never caught on. Each of these is possible in principle. None is comfortable. Start with the hoax. The 15th century had a market for marvels. A thick book filled with strange plants, naked stars, and an unreadable script would have been a powerful status object. Later, in Rudolf II's Prague, owning a mysterious book fitted neatly into imperial self-image. A clever forger could have leaned into that, copy the layout of real herbals and astrological manuals, distort the plants just enough, invent a script that looks vaguely like writing, and you have something that feels plausible without ever needing to say anything. Modern analyses have shown that you can algorithmically generate Voynich-like text. Follow a few recipes about which glyphs can appear where, introduce some variation, and you get word families, positional rules, even Zipf-like frequencies. A patient scribe with a consistent method could have done this by hand 600 years before computers. But the hoax theory has to clear some tall hurdles. The first is consistency. The Voynich text is not just patterned, it is patterned in a way that stays remarkably stable over hundreds of pages. Word families behave the same way in early botanical folios and late recipe pages. Section-specific vocabularies appear and reappear with discipline. If this is meaningless filler, it is filler generated by someone who could maintain a rigid, invisible rule system day after day without obvious slips. The second is effort. Parchment was expensive. So were pigments. The vellum has been radiocarbon dated to the early 1400s. The quire structure suggests a planned codex, not random scrap reuse. For a medieval or Renaissance hoaxer, this would have been a costly, time-consuming project. The likely payoff is speculative at best, and because the parchment dates to around 1400, a much later forger would have had to obtain a large stock of century-old blank bifolios that somehow survived unused, then orchestrate a forgery whose materials accidentally match that date band. Could it be done? Yes. Is it the simplest story? Not obviously. If you move to the cipher camp, the costs make more immediate sense. Imagine the manuscript as a technical manual or private notebook that its owner really did want to keep secret. Medical recipes, astrological judgments, proprietary knowledge. In that case, the unreadability is a feature, not a bug. Cryptographers have explored a whole zoo of possibilities. Null ciphers, where real text is hidden among garbage. Steganographic systems, where the message is encoded in layout, line breaks, or subtle variations. Codebooks, where each glyph sequence corresponds to a whole word or phrase, not a single letter. Multi-layer systems, where you first transform the language, say, into a shorthand or artificial cipher Latin, and then encipher that. The problem is that many of these systems are, by design, hard to falsify. If you propose that the real content lies only in every third character, or in the lengths of strokes, or in which symbols appear on which lines, you can always invent another layer when the first fails. If you say it's a codebook, you can attribute any mismatch to the missing book. Testing these ideas requires assumptions about what the plaintext language should be. How much compression is realistic? How complicated a system a 15th century scribe would actually use? Statistical hints cut both ways. Some features look compatible with a simple substitution cipher over a Romance or Germanic language. Others, like the unusual word structure and the way similar tokens cluster on the page, don't match the behaviour of straightforward enciphered Latin, Italian, or German. Then there are the language-first theories. Maybe Voynichese is a natural language written in a unique script, a local dialect, minority tongue, or professional jargon that simply never left many records. Medieval Europe was full of micro-languages, spoken in valleys and towns whose documents have long since rotted. If one of those communities developed a specialized orthography, half shorthand, half mnemonic, its surviving output might look alien to us. A constructed language is a nearby possibility. Someone could have systematically invented a phonology and morphology, designed a script to match, and used it within a small intellectual circle. The text's internal regularities fit that scenario neatly. So does the fact that no one else seems to have used the script. Private writing systems often die with their creators. The trouble here is isolation. Real languages and even private scripts tend to leak. Loan words appear in other texts. Bilinguals leave traces. Marginal notes explain oddities. So far the Voynich script appears nowhere else. No other manuscript has turned up that uses these glyphs to gloss a known tongue, or even repeats a short phrase we can recognize. Where does that leave us? Most working scholars, when pressed, hover near the middle. They tend to doubt a trivial hoax, because the structure is too rich and the effort too large for a simple fraud. They tend to doubt a straightforward enciphered Latin or Italian text, because repeated attempts with modern tools haven't produced stable, testable translations. They leave room for more exotic ciphers and for the possibility of an unknown or constructed language, but admit that the evidence is thin. What would change minds is not another clever pattern, but an anchor, a short bilingual, a second document in the same script with marginal glosses, a decoding method that can be applied by skeptics and still yields coherent, historically plausible readings across many pages without ad hoc fixes. Until something like that appears, all four families of hypotheses remain technically open. The manuscript sits in the Beinecke Library, 600 years of ink on early 1400s vellum, quietly refusing to tell us which story is true. So where does that leave us, practically? Right now, 600 years after someone dipped a quill into ink and began. There are a few things most specialists would sign their name under. They agree the parchment is real and old. Radiocarbon dating puts the vellum in the early 1400s. The quire structure, the ruling of lines, the way the gatherings were planned, all point to a deliberately made codex, not a scrapbook of reused scraps. They agree the script is not a random scrawl. The glyph inventory is stable. The words obey consistent rules about which symbols can start or end them. The distribution of word lengths, the way some tokens cling to line beginnings, the presence of section-specific vocabularies, these are all real, measured patterns. They agree the illustrations match, in broad strokes, late medieval interests. Plants and baths and zodiac diagrams are exactly what you would expect in a world of herbals, medical astrology, and humoral theory. The manuscript is strange, but it is strange inside a familiar genre, and beyond that consensus almost everything important is still argued over. Whether the script encodes sound or meaning, or nothing at all. Whether the plant drawings are distorted versions of known species or entirely imaginative. Whether the stars accompany a calendar or a horoscope manual, or something we don't even have a word for. Whether the text was meant to be read at all, or was more like a ritual object whose very unreadability gave it power. This is why no one can read it is, in a practical sense, still true. We can count word frequencies, we can cluster similar tokens and watch them swirl into families. We can say that certain sequences prefer the ends of lines, or that some pages have unusually repetitive text. But we cannot open to folio 20 and say, with any shared confidence. This is a recipe for a wound salve, or this paragraph explains a bathing regimen for pregnant women. Every claimed translation so far has failed on the same basic tests. It works on a few lines the author chose to demonstrate, but not on many pages picked by someone else. It requires so many exceptions and special rules that almost any text could be made to fit. It delivers readings that could mean almost anything, vague, astrological-sounding phrases, or herbal advice so generic it could have been written about any plant. So, if you hear that someone has finally cracked the Voynich, how do you think about that claim? There are a few simple questions you can ask, even without being a cryptographer. Provenance. Where is this solution coming from? Is it built on publicly available images and data or on private scans no one else can inspect? Does the method rely on secret tables or lost notebooks or unverifiable anecdotes? Reproducibility. Can another person, starting only from the published rules, independently apply the system and get the same readings? Not just for 3 lines, but for dozens of pages. If the answer depends on the original solver's intuition, feel for the language, or gift, that's a red flag. Predictive power. Did the method make risky predictions that could be checked? For example, this page should contain an unknown plant with these features, or this zodiac chart should have an extra missing folio here. Or did it simply retrofit meanings to pages we already know are about plants, stars, and baths? Peer scrutiny. Have specialists in medieval manuscripts, historical linguistics, and cryptanalysis had a chance to examine the proposal, criticize it, and try to break it? An idea that only survives inside its creator's circle is not yet strong evidence, no matter how elegant it looks on a slide. Underneath all of this is a deeper lesson the Voynich keeps teaching, whether we listen or not. Some artifacts sit right at the edge of what our evidence can support. They tempt us to jump the gap, to fill silence with stories, to turn thin data into solid narrative. The manuscript is a kind of training ground for resisting that urge. It rewards patience. It punishes certainty. It asks us to hold several possibilities in our heads at once and to let them remain possibilities. To say, this looks like a plausible explanation, given what we know now, instead of, this is what happened. To separate what the measurements actually show, ink composition, glyph frequencies, choir structure, from the stories we build around them. If you enjoy wandering through questions like this, we've put together a book that lingers in the same kind of mysteries. Slow, careful history you can fall asleep to. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a small discount for viewers of this series. The Voynich Manuscript, in the meantime, continues to sit in its climate-controlled box at Yale, refusing to collapse into a single neat explanation. It is an active, living mystery, not because it hides a code we just haven't guessed yet, but because it keeps forcing us to confront the limits of what we can know about the past. And there is a kind of quiet comfort in that. Not every page in history will turn for us. Some will stay closed, their meaning just out of reach. Learning to sit with that, to let the not knowing be part of the experience, rather than a flaw to be fixed, might be the most valuable thing this unreadable book has to teach. So, as we step back from it, what actually remains on the table, after 600 years of speculation have been pared down by ink analysis, radiocarbon tests, and careful cataloguing. We have a real book on real animal skin prepared in the early 1400s. The vellum isn't fantasy, it's been dated from multiple samples. The gatherings are sewn, the margins ruled, the quires numbered. Someone, or more than one someone, planned this as a coherent codex. We have a script that behaves like writing, but matches no known alphabet. The glyphs recur in stable combinations. Words appear, disappear, and cluster in ways that look like a human language at work, at least on the surface, but no dictionary, no grammar, no parallel text has ever turned the key. We have distinct clusters of illustrations that fall into recognizable late medieval genres. a long run of botanical pages with impossible plants whose roots and leaves refuse to line up neatly with any herbarium. Circular diagrams packed with stars, zodiacs, and cosmological wheels that almost but not quite fit the patterns of known astrology manuals. Crowded balneological pages with naked bodies in pipes and tubs and green pools that echo medical bathing traditions, yet follow rules no surviving text explains. Quieter pages near the end with lines of short paragraphs that look like recipes or notes, but keep their secrets. And we can follow the book's modern life with unusual clarity. From its likely presence in the orbit of Rudolf II's Prague court, through Jesuit collections, to Wilfrid Voynich's purchase in 1912, from a villa south of Rome, down into the catalogues of the WWII Library at Yale, where it sits today under a call number and a schedule of supervised viewings. Within that frame, the question at the centre is still open. Is this a hoax constructed with medieval care, meaninglessly patterned but convincing enough to fool even us? Is it a cipher masking a real language behind a veil of substitution or algorithmic transformation? Is it a genuinely lost tongue, written in its own script, orphaned from the speech community that once made sense of it? The evidence we have can lean a little in each direction, but it does not yet lock into one. That uncertainty says something not just about the Voynich, but about how texts behave in history. Most of the time, writing survives in bundles, multiple copies, marginal glosses, translations, references in other works. The context cushions our ignorance. If we lose a page, 3 other manuscripts fill in the gap. If we forget a word, a parallel passage rescues it. Here, the cushion is gone. We have a single artifact, in a single copy, in a unique script, with no quoted passages, no colophons naming author or patron, no later scholar copying out a line to argue with it. It is language, or language-like behaviour, stripped of its community. When that happens, even the best tools begin to fail. Cryptography can tell us the text is patterned, but not what those patterns point to. Linguistic statistics can tell us that its word distributions resemble natural languages more than random noise, without being able to say which language family, or even whether there is sound beneath the symbols at all. History can anchor the parchment and the ink and the chain of owners, but not the thoughts that shape the sentences. So the manuscript sits there, reminding us that some messages are contingent on more than ink and skin. They depend on a living web of speakers, readers, teachers, scribes and students. Break the web, scatter the people, let a few crucial copies mould away in damp chests or burn in quiet fires, and whole worlds of meaning can vanish so completely that we cannot even be sure what it is we've lost. And yet there's value in keeping this particular door propped open. Leaving the Voynich unresolved keeps a small space in our mental museum for humility. It lets us practice living with evidence that is strong on some points and whisper thin on others. It makes room for new tools, new ideas, new fragments of context that might someday surface from an archive box or a monastery attic and change the shape of the debate. It also gives us an excuse, now and then, to sit quietly with a mystery that asks nothing of us but attention. No urgency, no breaking news, just a strange book from 6 centuries ago, refusing to tell us who wrote it or why. If you've enjoyed drifting through that quiet with us, it would genuinely help if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss future stories. And since it's always interesting to see how far the ripples reach, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. If you'd like to wander further into deep time and other unsolved chapters of our past, there's a book waiting for you. Slow, prehistoric secrets told in the same careful, sleep-friendly way. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, the Voynich Manuscript goes back into its box and we leave its pages closed. The mystery stays open.